But one of the other things that we wanted to do on our podcast was provide each episode a couple of concepts or terminology that are common in LLM spaces, but might be very alien to lawyers. And every week offer a couple of those for people to think about. And one of the ones that I wanted to toss to you, Bridget, because I think it leads into the work that you're doing at the AAA, is the idea of artificial intelligence that is probabilistic versus artificial intelligence that is deterministic. When people are talking about those two different terms, what do they mean?
Yeah. So probabilistic is when, and please jump in if you think I'm not answering this clearly enough, is when outputs are generated based on probability distribution. So each outcome can produce different results, even with the same prompt, the same question. And so there is some randomness and uncertainty involved. And it is, therefore, you could view it as flexible and creative, but also less predictable, which is, as you might imagine, quite disconcerting for lawyers. And I'm sure we'll talk a lot about that. But most large language models like GPT and Claude are probabilistic models. And deterministic, of course, I'm sure most people are familiar with this, is when outputs are fixed for a given input. So no matter if you ask the same question 10 times, you're going to get the same answer. The outputs, like I said, are fixed. And there isn't, therefore, randomness involved in working with a deterministic AI. It's more consistent, it's reproducible, it's also less creative, can be a little less fun. But for some rule-based systems and some, AI systems, that is the best model. And you could imagine some contexts where that is the only model somebody would want to use. Do you think I missed something important in my telling of the difference there?
No, not at all. That's exactly how I would describe it. And I think most lawyers are used to artificial intelligence that is deterministic. If they're using it in their practice to date, they can look under the hood and develop an algorithm that, you give it certain inputs, it will give you an output. And it's part of the angst I think lawyers are feeling now is this is a different kind of technology. And it makes many of them, I think, very uncomfortable that you don't have that reliability of deterministic outputs.
Yeah, and we'll have this conversation over and over again, but it is interesting because obviously, humans are more probabilistic than deterministic, right? If you ask, I know you are a very smart lawyer. I think I am a fairly smart lawyer. You could ask us the same legal question, and like many legal questions, if there's nuance, we might give slightly different answers. We would certainly put them differently, but they might even be slightly different answers. And that's in some ways, what lawyers do is try and figure out the best answer to the question before them. But I do understand the discomfort in working with a technology that might not give you the same answer to the same question 30 seconds apart or 1 second apart. So it's interesting. How about the term hallucinations? Everybody talks about hallucinations, but what exactly does that term mean in the context of generative AI?
Yeah, and it's funny because hallucinations has become such a different word to me. I used to think of it as like, a human being hallucinating something on drugs or something like that. But hallucinations have gained a lot of attention in the legal space because of this probabilistic model. And really, hallucinations, and correct me if I'm missing anything, the way these models are trained is essentially a predictor of the next most likely word or token in a vector of the language on which the models have been trained. And so there's not thought happening behind these predictive outputs. And sometimes what happens is the machine generates something that in its training is coming next in that series of words. But in the context of the questions we're asking the model, it doesn't make sense and appears to be completely made up. And of course, the most famous example that set us all back months in the conversation is the ChatGPT lawyer from last year, where the ChatGPT hallucinated a case name that didn't exist, and the lawyer filed a brief containing that case name with a federal court. But that's my understanding of hallucinations is that sort of probabilistic outcome that is non-existent in our sense of reality.
Yeah, and it's definitely been a significant stumbling block for a lot of, I think, uptake in legal. It's a and understandably so. I did a presentation last week to the appellate judges in the state of Missouri, and I sort of did a what you and I often do together, a state of the technology, and then what are some of the immediate pros, some of the things you have to be looking out for. And hallucinations and that one lawyer in New York who set us all back about 5 years was mostly what they knew about generative AI. So
It's funny, isn't it? I feel like maybe one of the reasons it's so troubling to lawyers is because, like you said, we are actually very probabilistic in the way that we write as humans. And it's interesting, as you were saying that, I was thinking back to very early days when lawyers would say that the value that we add is our own individual style and tone and bite to our writing, but it also seems to be the thing that makes lawyers uncomfortable. But we don't typically hallucinate. You might have a junior lawyer who doesn't understand the holding of a case or misses a nuance, but they're generally not submitting work product to a judge or a partner that has completely made up case names.
I think that's absolutely right. You don't see that. You do, however, I think sometimes with junior lawyers, or at least with brand new clerks, see, citations that are kind of miss the mark because, a brand new lawyer who might not understand the larger context in which the legal question arises just doesn't have the experience yet to kind of figure out what the why the answer might not be the best fit. But you're right. They don't usually make up. I have not had, I never had a clerk when I was on the bench make up a case name. So as far as I know.
As far as we know, for sure. So those are a couple of concepts that we thought might be helpful for people to understand